1 Timothy chapter 6, and we're going to start in verse 6. Come on in, everybody. Start in verse 6. We'll go through verse 11, and then we will hop down to verse 17. I think I have that here. Yes, I do. All right. So Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6, verse 6, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. But thou, O man of God, flee these things and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness." Now skipping down to verse 17. "Charge them that are rich in this world that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. That they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life." So I want to talk today about the perils and the potential of wealth. And, we've been talking through the book of 1 Timothy, and I do want to point out that you might be looking at this outline going, this kind of looks like a Pastor Smith outline. That's because it is a Pastor Smith outline. Pastor Smith, on a little bit short notice, said, "Hey, I need to be gone on Wednesday. Are you able to teach?" So I was able to take his material. I put my own spin on it. So anything that you don't like, it's probably my fault. If it's good, it's probably Pastor Smith. But he did, for those that are teachers in here, Darla, I'm not plagiarizing this, I promise. I put little, modified with permission. But if you're looking at this going, well, this sure looks like Pastor Smith's stuff. Yes, it is. But again, this is one of the things that I've spoken on a number of times in a number of different contexts of how does a Christian handle money? How does a Christian deal with wealth, so to speak? And it's something that I find very interesting, and it's very relevant in this modern time. So if we look at kind of where we find ourselves in this current cultural aspect of 2025. If you look at your notes, there are two attitudes that dominate our culture regarding people and money. Two attitudes that dominate our culture. The first is greed. They that have money, and yet they never have enough. Greed. And then also there's covetousness. So you have greed and covetousness. Now the interesting thing is, greed, it's okay, they have money and they never have enough. Covetous, those that desire and long for what others possess. A lot of people, they see greed and go, oh, those rich people or those people that have money, those are people are greedy. I'm coveting what they want. That's okay because I don't have it. But the interesting thing is, covetousness is not limited to just those people that might not have wealth. You might be shocked to find out that you can have a lot of wealth and still be very covetous. If Roy has his 100-foot yacht and I only have a 50-foot yacht, it's like I don't, how do I compare to Roy? I mean, I'm just not as successful as Roy because my yacht is just not as nice as, his is way nicer than mine. And it's absolutely crazy because I did a little bit of research into this as I started digging into this, what kind of these attitudes that are very prevalent in our society. And you're looking at this going, Paul's talking about this kind of stuff in AD 64, which is approximately when 1 Timothy was written. And yet, you could take this right out of any newspaper in 2025, and it's still applicable to this day. And what's crazy is, when we talk about greed and you talk about covetousness, again, like I said just a second ago, you might think, well, this is for people who don't have, and they're coveting something that they don't have. They don't have a lot of money. Those are the people that have this problem. And the interesting thing is, again, multimillionaires, even billionaires, are worried about losing their wealth. They're worried about who has the better, who has more, who has the bigger house, who has the bigger yacht. And we joke about it, but what's amazing is they've done some studies on ultra high net worth individuals, which I think is 30 million and above. So probably most of the people in this room, but $30 million and above. And some of these people are paralyzed with covetousness and greed and worry. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. A wealth management firm that I saw talked about that a significant number of those with over $100 million are kept awake at night for fear of loss. And it's interesting because, if you had 100 million, you would think that if you lost $1 million, well, you still have 99. That's better than what I've got. But this literally keeps them up at night. And it's one of the reasons that so many people are taken advantage of, because they're like, hey, I can keep your money safe and all this stuff, and it ends up being a scam. And the other interesting thing is people talk about greed, people talk about covetousness, they talk about people just holding on to their wealth and not doing anything with it. And again, not just people that have a lot of money. But I did a little bit of math here, and it's very interesting. If you have $300 billion, which there is a person or two that has, a few dollars like that, it's like, oh, they gave $300 million last year. Well, $300 million is like us donating $100 or $200. So it's like, wow, you gave $100, or $200 a year in donations. Like, that's not that much. And they've actually said that the higher your net worth is, in most cases, the less that you give to anything, any cause, church, spiritual, just charity or anything like that. And it's crazy. Again, people see a large number like, oh, this person gave a $10 million donation, but that'd be like me giving somebody a quarter. So, there's this greed, there's this covetousness, and they don't want to lose anything that they have. And that's just prevalent in our society. But we have some truths that we can glean from this passage of Scripture that can help us avoid these traps. So first thing I want to do is look at these 4 truths that the godly recognize about wealth. The first one is that the godly recognize the true source of contentment. If we look here at chapter 6, verse 6, you can see that Paul writes, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content." So the first point I want to cover, which I think is labeled point B, is godliness leads to contentment. And this is one of those things, again, you would think, and I even struggle with this as a believer. Well, if I just had a 401k of this level, or if I just had a nice house that was paid for, if I just had a nice car that was paid for, I would be happy, I would be, everything would be good. And it's, well, okay, first of all, I'm not being content with what I have. And second of all, as we learn from some of these people that have it all, they can have it all and they still worry, they still covet, they still are kept up at night worrying about losing what they have. So having more does not bring you that contentment. So godliness leads to contentment. A devout believer finds his contentment in God, not in his wealth. He is not motivated by the love of money, but by the love of God. And his contentment derives from his faith and trust in the sufficiency and promises of God, which we'll talk about those promises here in a little bit. But like I was talking about just a second ago, wealth does not lead to contentment. Money is temporal. We brought nothing into this world. It is certain we can carry nothing out. There's that old adage of you don't see a U-Haul behind the hearse as it's going to the funeral. And there's that old kind of proverb, whatever you want to call it, that's like, well, how much did they leave to family or whatever? What's the answer? They left it all. So we can't take anything with us. So why are we relying on this to find our contentment? We can't take it with us. Once we die, we're not taking it with us. So we need to find our contentment in God. And the interesting thing is, contentment is discovered in simple things. Look at verse 8, and having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. It's very interesting. Jim Bailey and I were talking about a few places that we've visited or have had family visit that are, on the front facade look very, very successful, very flashy, very modern. But if you go out into the country a little bit, it's really a third world. And what's absolutely crazy is I had a family member that was going out into the countryside of China and staying with a family that was very poor. And they had clothes, they had a meal, they had a roof over their head, and they were happy. And it was very interesting and very, very challenging for her in that they had so little, and yet they were content with what they had. And what really shocked her was her supervisor or whatever you want to call said something along the lines of, when you see the food they put in front of you as their guest, that will probably be their meat ration for the month. So they are going to give this to you as a guest and, eat it because it's they're sharing what they have with you. The little bit that they have, they're sharing with you. And she felt, very honored and humbled to do this. But as she got back into Shanghai, and she's doing this, back in the big city, she's like, you have all these people, flashy cars, flashy houses and all this stuff, they're not content. And yet this small Christian family in a backwater place, for lack of a better term, out in the countryside, they had a house, they had food, they had clothes, and they were content. So it's very interesting. Something else we'll talk about, and we'll actually get into this a little bit more, but Paul warned Timothy, and I think I've got this here. Yes, Paul warned Timothy, the love of money is the root of all evil. And if we look at verse 10 there, for the love of money is the root of all evil, while some have coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. We'll talk about this more in a second, but those people have said, hey, this is more important than godliness. This is more important than my integrity. I'm going to go this way, and they end up regretting it in the long term. So first thing is, the godly recognize where true contentment comes from. Secondly, the godly recognize the perils of money. In verses 9 and 10 specifically, Paul talks about, but they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So if we look at, how do we recognize these perils? Well, the first thing is the love of money enslaves. And there's some extra, sometimes we look at something in English and it doesn't seem quite as obvious, but they that will be rich. The idea there is they that are seeking to be rich, they that are pushing after, that are seeking out riches, fall into temptation and a snare. So they're earnestly desiring, they're craving after the riches, and this causes the problems that they run into. So the love of money enslaves, they that will be rich. And it breeds covetousness, which we talked about just a little while ago. They crave after that, they crave after things that others possess. And we talk about the 10th commandment, thou shalt not cover thy neighbor's house, cover thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, they're violating the 10th commandment right there. And so as we look at this, the love of money enslaves those that are seeking it. Did I see your hand over here? No. Okay. The second thing I want to mention in letter B there is the love of money entraps. And it says, they that will be rich fall into temptation. And so the love of money entraps. Well, how does it entrap? Well, Paul talks about that. Well, they fall into temptation. And the idea behind that Greek word is they continually fall into temptation. It's just not a one-time thing. They repeatedly fall into temptation. And the discontentment, it's continual thing that just keeps going. And you see this again, even in people that have as much wealth as more wealth than we can possibly imagine, and yet they're still tempted by more and more and more. Secondly, they fall into a snare, and it's ruled by greed and unable to escape. And a snare, anybody know what a snare was? Anybody explain what a snare is when we're talking about in the biblical sense? A bird trap. It was a trap for an animal. And the idea would be, there's something that the animal wants, food, something along those, that side of things. And it goes in and it's trapped. And this is exactly what Paul's talking about here, which is, it looks good. That wealth looks attractive, but then once you get to it and grab a hold of it, it has you. And now you're trapped. And look at number 3. Not only is it a snare, but we fall into many foolish and hurtful lusts. And this is interesting because you see there's both foolish and hurtful lusts. Sinful desires that are foolish, if you look at that. Pastor, as I was looking through these and looking at some of Pastor's notes, he put in parentheses for one of his contexts of useless. And this is something that isn't necessarily wrong in its own sense, but it's something that's useless. It's something that, it doesn't have any real purpose. We'll talk about, people who win the lottery in a little bit, but I heard of somebody that inherited a large sum of money, or they won a large amount of money. I don't remember how. And, it's like, let's say it's $3 million. And they spent most of that money on a model railroad set in their basement. Now, I've known some friends and some family that enjoy the model railroad. They have a very elaborate model railroad in their basement or whatever. Now, basements are these things we have up north that, no.
I was going to say, what is that?
Yeah, what is this basement thing you're talking about? But, so, is a model railroad a bad thing? No. But is spending $3 million on a model railroad and not investing any of that money, that seems like it's something that would be, useless. So now, and again, that doesn't appeal to me. My sister and I, we had kind of a railroad and kind of one of the car raceways, and we always just tried to get the train and the car to meet. A little destructive, but but this again, it's not something that's necessarily bad, but it's useless. It doesn't make a difference. So why are we focusing on that? So that's the foolish side of that thing. If you look at also sinful desires that are hurtful, and these are items that are actually harmful to morals, harmful to health, harmful to the soul. And I have had, friends, family, and many others that, they get a little bit of money, whether it's get a bonus at work or whatever, and they drink themselves into a stupor. And that's just normal. And anytime they get a little bit of extra money, it's immediately gone, and they're, literally fall down drunk. And, it's painful to their families. It's damaging to them, obviously. And, anytime they have any money whatsoever, that's where it goes. And that's the kind of thing that Paul's talking about here of these are hurtful, these are harmful lusts. And, this is one of those things where, again, it seems obvious until you're in that situation and then you're watching this from the outside going, don't you guys see this? But unfortunately, going back to they're in a snare. They're caught in that trap and they don't know how to get out. And then letter C there, sinful desires invite God's judgment. Paul talks about drown men in destruction and perdition or misery. And so this is where, God's word warns about these things, and yet we ignore those warnings and we proceed ahead, and that's why we're foolish and we're following these lusts and we're injuring ourselves, we're harming ourselves, and we're just continuing to do it anyway. And so Paul is talking, well, wait a second, this is not what we should be doing. Next, the love of money entices. This kind of, the idea here is, there it is. The affection for silver or gold have undermine their love and devotion for God. Paul wrote in 2 Timothy, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed unto Thessalonica. So now we're talking about where we actually have, some of these other passages, they might not have been, Christians that Paul was specifically talking about, but now we're talking about, well, wait a second, some have coveted after, but they've erred from the faith. And, I couldn't help but think of a few people in the broad Christian circles, for lack of a better term, that, maybe it's music, maybe it's, books, etc., that they start out in the broadly Christian world, and they get popular, and they're like, well, if I do this, if I make some modifications to my music, if I don't really sing about God anymore, or Jesus, or anything that offends people, I could be really popular and break out into the mainstream media. And they compromise their morals, they compromise their faith in order to gain more money, in order to be more popular, and to have more influence. And they set aside everything that everything that the Lord's given them. They set that aside so that they can pursue something bigger to the detriment of their soul. Did you have something, Greg? No? Okay. Sorry. By the way, I would love for this to be interactive, so please feel free to, if you have a comment, feel free to mention something. So we're talking about the unfaithfulness to God, and we talked about this right at the beginning. Encourages anxieties. Number 2, pierce themselves through with many sorrows. And this, again, is one of those things where you would think if, and again, even as a Christian, I struggle with this idea of, well, if I just had a bunch of money, then all these problems would go away. And in fact, that's not the case. Now, I did a little bit of research, and there's mixed numbers on this, but we all have heard the stories about people that won the lottery and are bankrupt just a few years later. And again, if you spend $3 million on the model train set and don't set any aside for living, yeah, you're probably going to go bankrupt, and then you're hoping that somebody's going to buy your model railroad for $3 million, But you hear of these people, and not just, they go bankrupt, but they commit suicide, or they're murdered by a family member because of the money. And so this is one of those things where it's, the anxiety, the problems that come in. Again, it sounds good. Oh, hey, they won $100 million. And then you talk to them just a few months or a few years later, and it's, wait, you're broke? You're bankrupt? Like, how did you blow through all that money in that amount of time? But it's very common for people that inherit large sums of money or win the lottery. So we've talked about, the love of money entices. Well, let's talk about fleeing that and following godly virtues. So Paul's warned us about the perils of money. So let's talk about what we should be fleeing. So in verse 11, Paul talks about we need to flee materialism and follow godly virtues. But thou, O man of God, flee these things and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness. And so, we flee these things, letter A. And what do we flee? Well, we're fleeing the stuff that Paul was just talking about, the covetousness, the compromising our faith in order to gain more money. And instead, we're to follow something. And I love when Paul talks about this, where it's not just don't do this, don't do those. It's like, no. Here are the things we need to avoid, but this is what we should be following after. This is what we should actually be doing. And I'd love to cover this in detail, but this would be a whole sermon in and of itself. But we're supposed to follow and pursue 6 things: righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and meekness. So we're supposed to be completely different from the world. We're supposed to turn away from what the world's doing with money, and we're supposed to follow these righteous things. Now, we'll talk about some specifics here in just a second. So part of the reason I wanted to include verses 17 through 19 is Paul actually talks about some of the positive things or the potential of money. So the godly, number 4, recognize the potential of money. And Paul writes in verse 17, charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. So we see there that the godly recognize the potential of money. Now, you might be looking at that going, okay, they that are rich, I'm not rich, so I don't need to listen, right? Sean, I am not independently wealthy. I am not wealthy at all. Can I just skip all this stuff that we're talking about? And the answer is no. Anybody, we talk about the U.S., and it's like, well, I don't have very much money in the context of the United States. That's a little bit different than the context of the world. Like I mentioned, some of these friends that are missionaries, you want to talk about a whole different idea of what wealth and poverty is. Travel the world, and you can see that. So I did just a little bit of study, and let me see if I can find my notes here. And yes, here it is. So I looked up 2 locations that we have a connection with. I looked up Togo, West Africa, so Yalvi, where we have our missionary in Togo, and I looked up Peru with the Fitzgeralds. And what I found was that in Togo, West Africa, there's a few ways that you can calculate this. I won't get into the economics of it, but the average income is between $1,000 and $3,000 a year. So that's the average, which means there's a lot of people below that. In Peru, it's a little bit higher, but the average income is $8,000 to $16,000, again, depending on how you calculate it out. So, as I've been doing this research, I found there are 500 million people that live on less than $800 a year in the world. And what's amazing is, as I was looking at this income, as I was looking at, the idea of living on $800 a year, not a month, a year, I realized that, I graduated all the way back in 2003, and I had a job, and I considered it kind of a dead-end job. It was not something that I wanted to do for the rest of my career, but it was, well, I'll do this. I graduated. I just need some money. I'll do this. So I was a security officer. Wasn't even a manager. I was just a security officer. And honestly, it was boring as all get out, because it was basically sit here for 8 hours. You can't do anything besides stare at this empty lobby. So it was actually kind of torture for me, because some people thought it was great because they got to sit there for 8 hours and do nothing. But for me, it was torture. But I look back at that and realize I was making double or triple what the average person in Peru makes at that dead-end job in 2003. That's not adjusted for inflation. And I'm like, okay, that was right after college, and I was making way more than the majority of the people in the world will ever make in a year. And that was just right out of college working a dead-end job. And if we look at what we're making here in this room, even those of us that are on the lowest end of the scale in this room are on the high scale if you look at the world. And again, when I hear of people that talk about, well, I make $1 a day, I make $2 or $3 a day, and they're doing they're selling things or whatever, and it's like, and they're barely scraping by. We look here in the U.S. and look at everything we have, the comfortable life that we have, and hate to break it to everybody, we fall into the category that Paul's explaining here. So sorry, you have to listen to what Paul says. So let's talk about recognizing the potential of money, and then we'll get to some specific application here in a second. So first of all, Paul has a warning and an admonition. And I do want to point out that number one, Paul does not condemn wealth. And that's something that a lot of people talk about. Well, Paul, in the Bible condemns wealth, and that's not the case. It's the love of money that is the root of all evil. But number two, Paul instructed Timothy to guide the rich, to have two things. Number one, the right attitude concerning wealth, be not high-minded. So the idea here is, don't look down on somebody that doesn't have the same level of wealth that you do. And again, that can go for us in the context of here in the United States. This can also go the context of us to other locations of the world. You know, just because that family in China that our family member was, you know, visiting with, just because they made a whole lot less than what I do, doesn't mean that, you know, they were inferior. In fact, I'm pretty sure they were much more spiritual than I am, because they were happy with what they had in that simple existence. They were content with what they had. They had the Lord, and they had their basic needs, and that's all they needed. So, you know, don't look down on people like that, especially if they're having a good relationship with the Lord, where ours needs a little work. Second piece that Paul was instructing Timothy is to have the right perspective on wealth, nor trust in uncertain riches. All you have to do, especially in the last month or two, is turn on the business show looking at the stock market, and, you know, they talk about the roller coaster and all of that stuff. And, you know, if your piece is tied to what your 401k balance is, you've had a rough ride. If you're relying on just wealth to be that thing that sustains you, as you watch your balance go up and down, you get very anxious. And Paul says, no. The right perspective is, don't trust in uncertain riches. They might last, might not. So we need to trust in the Lord, not in riches. So as we start to wrap up here, I want to talk about 5 exhortations for those that are seeking wealth or have wealth. And again, hate to break it to you, but that includes us here in this room, because we live in the United States. So a little bit of application here, but Paul kind of has some rapid fire exhortations for us to learn as we are dealing with, you know, having money, having a little bit of money. So in verse 17 again, charge them that are rich in this world that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy, that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. So let's talk about these things. So first of all, you know, we talked about this just a second ago. They need a trust in the living God, who giveth us giveth us richly all things to enjoy. So again, we have to have our trust in God versus in the stock market and our bank account and our 401k. I also want to add that God blesses his people with wealth and possessions that exceed their needs, so that they can serve as channels of blessings to others. We have a number of people in this church family that routinely give to Deacons Benevolence, give to other people that have needs as they have opportunity. And that's really the system that Paul the Apostle set up, of maintaining, helping those needs in the body. And you know, there's all sorts of examples that I can look at in the past. I know that there was a church that we were associated with that needed handbells. This actually sounds very similar to Hillsdale. Your pastor had wanted handbells for a long time, but they just couldn't afford them. Just off the top of your head, Steve, like, what's a set of handbells cost? Any idea?
$25.
Yeah. Is that a good estimate, like accurate? Okay. I just didn't know if he was just throwing out a random number. Sometimes I can't tell when he's joking, but no. Okay, so $25,000. So as you can imagine, for a small church, that is not a small amount of money. And so, but there was a family that found out about this need. They had had a good year that year, had a good significant income that had come their way. And so they anonymously provided those handbells. And again, you know, the interesting thing is, a lot of people don't know how expensive handbells are. So they're like, oh, got a set of handbells, like no big deal. It's like, no, it's a pretty big deal. Those are not cheap. And yet they did that to be a blessing to the church, and they didn't want any credit for it, but they wanted to be a blessing for the church and have something that could be used in ministry for that local church. So we can serve as channels of God's blessing to others. The second exhortation is do good. Do good. And this is being stewards of God's material blessings and to be a good steward and to do noble things with money. We talked again about taking care of people in the church, meeting needs, even meeting desires that might not be urgent needs like handbells. So do good, be stewards of God's material blessings. Number 3, be rich in good works and a conduit for God's blessing to others. If you look at, the idea of this is also shared in Galatians 6:10. Paul talks about, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially those that are of the household of faith. And you'll notice that Paul has kind of 2 different groups there. There's all men, but then there's also especially those of the household of faith. So it's not just that we help those that are in our local church, but it's if there's a need, if there's an urgent need and it's in the church, like yes, that should be the priority, but that's not the limit. We don't go, okay, we stop at the church and that's it. Instead, Paul says, let us do good unto all men. And so that's, again, not restricted to the church. That's broader world, whether that's giving to missionaries, whether it's just giving to other charitable organizations, whether it's just helping a family member or a friend. Be rich in good works. Number 4, be generous, ready to distribute. And then 5, be willing to communicate or share. And it goes back to some of these things where you can often tell, how you're, I've been talking with my sister with her 2 young children, and she said she could sometimes, as they were growing up especially and they were very young, she could kind of tell how their attitude was with how did they want to share with others. And this is something that they had to learn. This is something that she had to guide them in. She and her husband had to guide them in, because by very nature they wanted to do things their way. They wanted to keep their things, and they didn't want to share. And yet Paul talks about no, do good, be rich in good works, be generous, be willing to communicate or share. And again, you look at this compared to what we talked about at the beginning of this hour of what the world has been doing. This turns the whole thing on its head. So as we start to wrap up, I want to talk about the last, kind of the conclusion is maintaining an eternal focus and a heavenly account. Verse 19, Paul says, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. Now, just to be clear, this is not talking about, well, I'm going to buy my way into heaven. I just want to be very clear about that. However, the idea is that good works follow you to heaven. Giving money and possessions in this life is noted in heaven. And what we give contributes to our happiness on earth and our honor in heaven. Now, I also want to emphasize that this is not, well, I'm going to do this so that I can have the place of honor in heaven. I'm going to be able to lord this over everybody else. No, these are, to use another terminology that the Bible uses, these are crowns that we can take and lay at the feet of Jesus so that he gets the honor and the glory for everything. So this is not, all right, I'm going to do this, I'm just investing in my afterlife now so that I can have the bigger mansion and all of this stuff. No, the glory is all God's ultimately. But it's very interesting that, Paul talks about the fact that this is something that will have impact on us in heaven even after we die. So again, do we want to invest in riches that stay here and are divided amongst people once we die, or do we want to invest, maintain an eternal focus and a heavenly account? All right. Any questions, comments before we wrap up?
Well, my comment
Yep.
is something probably different, but it's laughing and I feel good with myself. I never have to spend too much money in horses. I know if you saw some, I don't go with TikTok or nothing like that. Coming to me, I think was Instagram or something, whatever. Just I'm looking at what, and then you do what you want. Look like a lot of Chinese who are not happy with what's going on in the world. They have enough of their government, and they did some video clips to let it know us the world. To that force, do you pay? There is people to pay $300,000 for it, just for it. Others to, like I said, others bought some names and then they take in the bus, and I've been here, whatever. They say those $300,000 for you can have it here with us directly for $2,000. It's like, what? They say, they say, I want to explain how this works. We do it here, we have everything, we make it, we send it over there and they bring it, they put the name and they send it to you. And they're like, please don't stop buying to us, we are with you. Claim it. They said that those glasses very expensive that people use. What's in the, I don't know, the marks. They say they cost you about $500 right here. For $2 you can have it. It's like, what?
Well, and again, it's still appealing to the greed and the covetousness and all of this stuff.
It's good.
Yeah. Absolutely crazy. Anything else before we wrap up? Well, appreciate everybody's attention and listening kindly to me.